Section number 49 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Naomi Brewster, Melbourne, Australia. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3, by Henry Charles LEA, Book number 3, Part 1, Spheres of Action, Protestantism. The fate of the little band of Spanish Protestants has, not unnaturally, excited the earnest sympathy of modern students. Much has been written about them. Their works have been gathered and reprinted with pious care, and the importance of the reformatory movement has been largely exaggerated. There never was the slightest real danger that Protestantism could make such permanent impression on the profound and unreasoning religious convictions of Spain in the 16th century as to cause disturbance in the body politic, and the excitement created in Valladolid and Seville in 1558 and 1559 was a mere passing episode leaving no trace in popular beliefs. Yet coming when it did, it exercised an enduring influence on the fortunes of the Inquisition and on the development of the nation. At the moment, the career of the Holy Office might almost seem to be drawing to a close, for it had nearly succeeded in extirpating Judaism from Spain, while the influx of Portuguese New Christians had not commenced, and its operations against the Moriscos of Valencia were suspended. The panic, skilfully excited at the appearance of Lutheranism, raised it to new life and importance, and gave it a claim on the gratitude of the state, which enabled it to dominate the land during the 17th century, while its audacious action against Carranza showed that no one was so high placed as to be beyond its reach. It gained, moreover, a firmer financial basis than it had previously enjoyed, while at the same time Inquisitor General Valdez was saved from banishment and disgrace. Yet more important even than all this was the dread inspired of heresy, which served as a reason for isolating Spain from the rest of Europe, excluding all foreign ideas, arresting the development of culture and of science, and prolonging medievalism into modern times. This was the true significance of the little Protestant movement and its repression, and it is this which deserves the attention of the student rather than the ghastly dramas of the auto de fe. Before the Lutheran revolt there was much liberty of thought and speech allowed throughout Catholic Europe. Neither Erasmus nor popular writers and preachers had scruple in ridiculing and holding up to detestation the superstitions of the people, the vices, the greed and the corruptions of the clergy, and the venality and oppression of the Holy See. The Franciscan Thomas Murner, who subsequently became the most virulent reviler of Luther, castigated the clergy, both regular and secular, with more vigor if with less skill than Erasmus. Erasmus himself, in his Enchiridion Militis Christiani, or Manual of the Christian Soldier, did not hesitate to stigmatize as a new Judaism the reliance reposed on external observances which had supplanted true piety, causing the teachings of Christ to be neglected, and the Enchiridion had been approved by Adrian VI, at this time the head of the University of Louvain. When, however, it became necessary, in order to cure these universally admitted evils, to strike at the dogmas of scholastic theology, of which these evils were the outcome, when Northern Europe was rising almost unanimously in Luther's support, and when the Curia recognized that it had to deal not with a mere scholastic debate between monks, but with a rapidly developing revolution, the necessity was soon felt of a rigid definition of orthodoxy. while the licence, which had been good-naturedly tolerated so long as it did not threaten the loss of power and wealth, became heresy, to be diligently inquired into and relentlessly punished. Men who esteemed themselves good Catholics, and had no thought of withdrawing from obedience to the Holy See, found themselves accused of heresy and liable to its penalties. Prior to the definitions of the Council of Trent, there was a certain amount of debatable ground, within which no authoritative decision had as yet rendered the speculations of the schoolmen articles of faith. Erasmus, for instance, had not been called to account for asserting that sacramental confession was not of divine law. But, as the conflict grew more desperate, and the Church found defence of its outworks to be requisite, it became heretical to question the divine origin of confession, even before the Council had made it defied. We shall then find the chief sufferers from an inquisitorial action divided into two classes. Before the middle of the century they largely consist of the unconscious heretics, of men who, prior to the condemnation of Luther, would have been reckoned as undoubtedly orthodox. After 1550, with some exceptions like Carranza, they were those who had knowingly and consciously embraced more or less of the doctrines of the Reformation. Outside of these, another and by no means the least numerous class can be defined of those who incurred more or less vehement suspicion of heresy through mere carelessness, in the constantly increasing rigour of external observance. It is doubtless to the first of these classes that we may refer the earliest victims of so-called Lutheranism, who I have found recorded. Gonsalvo, the painter of Montealegre in Murcia, a resident of Majorca, relaxed in 1523 by that tribunal as a Lutheran. It is inconceivable that Lutheran errors could have penetrated at that time to Majorca, or that the inquisitor could have had any clear conception of what they were, and, as Gonsalvo is described as a negative, he doubtless considered himself a good Catholic and perished because he would not admit himself to be otherwise. It was not until 1521 that the Curia was aroused to the necessity of preventing the dissemination in Spain of the new doctrines in the writings of Luther. The Nuncio Aleander, writing from Worms, February 18th of that year, mentioned that in Flanders Spanish versions of Luther's books were in press, through the efforts of the Mariani, and that Charles V had given orders to suppress them. Acting promptly on this, Leo X, on March 21st, addressed briefs to the Constable and Admiral of Castile, the governors in Charles's absence, exhorting them to prevent the introduction of such works, and Cardinal Adrian lost no time in ordering, April 7th, the tribunals to seize all the obnoxious volumes that they could find, an order which he repeated May 7th, 1523, together with instructions to the corregidors to enforce the surrender of the books to the inquisitors. Very earnest letters were also written April 12th and 13th, 1521, to Charles V, by an assembly of grandees, and by the President and Council of State, urging him to adopt strong measures to prevent the spread of Lutheranism, which had been introduced into Spain and threatened to develop. These may be regarded as measures rather precautionary than called for by existing exigencies. So far as the records of the Inquisition have been searched, there is no trace, for some years as yet, of prosecutions for Lutheranism, save the solitary case above referred to. With the return of Charles to Spain in 1522, the influence of Erasmus seems to promise a perpetuation of the freedom and even licence of speech, of which he was the protagonist. The emperor was his admirer, and he became the fashion among courtiers and churchmen pretending to culture. The Inquisitor General Manrique openly defended him, and so did the primate Alfonso Fonseca, Archbishop of Toledo. His immense reputation, the immunity conferred on him by the patronage of successive popes against the vindictiveness of the religious orders, provoked by his merciless ridicule and the futility of condemnations by scholastic faculties, seemed a guarantee for those who merely echoed the opinions to which he had given currency so wide. So it continued until in 1527 a translation of his Enchiridion was issued by Alonso Fernandez de Madrid, Archdeacon of Alcor. It was dedicated to Archbishop Manrique, who had it duly examined and authorized its publication. Its success was immediate, and it was universally read. From the standpoint of scholastic theology, however, it was too vulnerable not to invite attack from the religious orders. The pulpits which they virtually monopolized resounded with their denunciations until Manrique felt obliged to interfere. Many prominent frailes were summoned before the Suprema and sharply reproved for exciting the people against Erasmus, in defiance of repeated edicts. If they found errors in the book, they should denounce them to the Inquisition. The challenge was promptly accepted, and with the assistance of the English ambassador Edward LEA, subsequently Archbishop of York, a list of 21 articles was drawn up, ranging from Arianism to irreverence towards the Virgin and the denial of various essentials of sacerdotalism. These were submitted to an assembly of 20 theologians and 9 frailes, who disputed for a month over the first 2 articles. The debate promised to be interminable, and Manrique suspended it, at the same time issuing an absolute prohibition to write against Erasmus. As we have seen, however, he fell into disgrace in 1529 and was relegated to his see of Seville. Charles left Spain the same year, carrying with him some of the most powerful protectors of the Erasmists, and the inquisitors, who were largely frailes, were eager to detect the heresy latent in the latitude of speech which had become common among those who prided themselves on culture. A typical case of this kind is that of Diego de Uceda, to which allusion has already been made on other accounts. He was an hidalgo of Cordova, of unblemished Old Christian stock. Although a courtier, he was studious and deeply religious, even entertaining thoughts of entering the Geronimite order. Greatly admiring Erasmus, the failure of the effort to condemn him by the Inquisition gave assurance that his works were approved, and Diego earned some reproof by constantly quoting his opinions and endeavoring to impress them on others. In February 1528 he was journeying from Burgos to Cordova, and one evening at Corrizo he fell into discussion with a man named Rodrigo Duran, who, with his servant Juan de Avila, was on his way to Seville to embark for the West Indies. The talk fell upon confession, and then upon images, in which Diego quoted the views of Erasmus, then upon miracles, when he expressed disbelief in a story of a Christian slave in Africa who prayed for deliverance to Our Lady of Guadalupe. His master overheard him, placed him in a chest, made his own bed on top and slept there, with the result that next morning the chest was in Guadalupe with the master inside and the Christian on top. Something also was said about Luther, whose name got mixed up with that of Erasmus. Duran, on reaching Toledo, denounced Diego to the tribunal, his serving men furnishing the necessary contest, and went on his way to the Indies. Diego was tracked to Cordova and was sent back as a prisoner to Toledo, where he vainly protested his orthodoxy and offered submission to the Church, although his frequent allusions to Erasmus probably did his case no good. He proved by witnesses that he habitually confessed 4 times a year, that he took all indulgences, and that he was a man of blameless life and strong religious convictions. But it was all in vain. I have already shown how he was tortured, confessed and then revoked, and how he was condemned to a humiliating penance, July 22, 1529, ruining his career and leaving an indelible stain on a family that had boasted of its limpieza. The danger impending over Erasmists was still more forcibly illustrated by the case of one who was regarded as perhaps the foremost among them in Spain. No one stood higher for learning and culture than Dr. Juan de Vergara. He had been secretary for Ximenes as Archbishop of Toledo and subsequently to Fonseca, who succeeded to the primatial dignity in 1524. Ximenes had made him professor of philosophy at Alcala, where he had translated the Wisdom of Solomon for the Complutensian polyglot, and the treatises De Anima, De Physica and De Metaphysica for the projected edition of Aristotle. He was an elegant Latin poet, and Menendez y Pelayo tells us that he was the father of historical criticism. He was regarded with favor by Manrique, and was a warm defender of Erasmus in the contest over the Enchiridion. We shall have occasion thereafter to treat of the adventures of the Alumbrada Francisca Hernandez and the men whom she entangled in her toils. Among them was Bernardino de Tovar, also an Erasmist, half-brother of Vergara, who incurred her enmity by rescuing him from her clutches. To revenge herself, when on trial in 1530, she accused Vergara of holding all of Luther's doctrines except as to confession, and of possessing some of Luther's works, the latter accusation being true, but when, in 1530, Manrique ordered the surrender of all such books, Vergara, after some delay, carried them to the tribunal. Another of Francisca's disciples, Fray Francisco Ortez, when on trial, also accused Vergara of denying the efficacy of indulgences and abusing the University of Paris for condemning the writings of Erasmus, in which he said the Church had found no heretical errors. The tribunal collected some other evidence against Vergara and industriously searched for more, even as far as Flanders. In May 1530 a willing witness was found in Diego Hernandez, a buffoon of a priest, whom Mary Cazalla had employed as confessor until she dismissed him for seducing a nun and asserting that it was no sin. This worthy produced a list of 70 Lutheran heretics, qualified according to their degrees of guilt, among whom Vergara figured as fino Lutherano endiosado, mystically abstracted. Whatever hesitation there may have been in arresting such a man, however, disappeared when it was found, in April 1533, that he had been communicating with Tovar in prison by bribing the officials. The fiscal presented his clamosa, May 17, accusing Vergara of being a fautor and defender of heretics, a defamer of the Inquisition and a corrupter of its officials, and his arrest and imprisonment followed on June 24th. This occasioned general surprise. Archbishop Fonseca was deeply moved, and endeavored to obtain his release under bail for 50,000 ducats, or to have him confined in a house under guard, but the only result of his efforts was to lead the tribunal to shut up the windows of Vergara's cell, converting it into a dungeon and seriously affecting his health. The trial proceeded through the regular stages. He refused the services of an advocate, and on January 29, 1534, he presented his defence, denying nearly all the errors attributed to him, and explaining the rest in a Catholic sense. After this, a fresh accusation was presented based on his friendship for and correspondence with Erasmus, to whom he had induced Archbishop Fonseca to grant a pension. Fonseca had died February 24th, so that his evidence was unattainable, But Vergara pronounced the story as to the pension to be false, though had it been true it would have been innocent. Everyone knew that Erasmus had neither income nor benefice, never having been willing to accept either, and that he was supported by the liberality of gentlemen who contributed to him from all parts. Fonseca had only offered him an income if he would come to reside in Alcala, an offer which Ximenes had previously made. It was true that when Erasmus dedicated to him his edition of St. Augustine, Fonseca sent him 200 ducats, scarce enough, in the case of so large a work, to give the printers their customary pourboire. Fonseca felt this, and when he heard of the death of Archbishop Warham of Canterbury, 1532, who was accustomed to provide liberally for Erasmus, he said that he ought to pay for the printing of the book, whereupon Vergara wrote that he would send something, but it was not done. As for corresponding with Erasmus, popes and kings and the emperor himself were gratified to have letters from him, and in the printed collections of his epistles were to be found his answers to Vergara, showing that the latter had urged him to write in confutation of Luther. The day after this defence was presented there came the most serious evidence as yet offered against him. This was from another distinguished Erasmist, then on trial, Alonso de Virues, who testified that 4 years before, in a discussion whether the sacrament worked ex opere operato, Vergara ridiculed it as a fantastic opinion, and further that he did not hold as he should certain pious and Catholic doctrines. It is true that the Council of Trent had not yet pronounced, as it did in 1547, the self-operation of the sacrament to be defied, but the doctrine was coeval with the development of the sacramental theory in the 12th century, and was indispensable in vindication of its validity in polluted hands against the Donatist heresy. To deny it, even in disputation, could not fail to prejudice Vergara's case, which dragged on in spite of the efforts of his friends, and even of the empress, to expedite it. At length, on December 21, 1535, he was sentenced to appear as a penitent in an auto de fe, to abjure de vehementi, to be recluded in a monastery for a year irremissibly, and to pay a fine of 1,500 ducats. In 3 months, however, Manrique charitably transferred him to the cathedral cloister, and on February 27, 1537, his confinement came to an end. He incurred no disabilities. His reputation seems not to have suffered, for he retained his Toledo canonry, and, as we have seen, he incurred in 1547 the displeasure of Archbishop Cilicio by opposing the Statute of Limpieza. Virues was a similar victim to the revulsion against Erasmus. He was a Benedictine abbot of San Tholo, a learned Orientalist and the favourite preacher of Charles V, who had carried him to Germany. Envy of his favour at court caused his denunciation. Isolated passages in his sermons were cited against him, and he was thrown in prison in 1533. His incarceration lasted for 4 years, in spite of Charles's efforts for his liberation. It was in vain that he pleaded that some 14 years before Erasmus had been regarded as orthodox, and that he adduced the arguments which he had used against Melanchthon in the Diet of Ratisbon. In 1537 he was declared to be suspect of Lutheranism. He was required to abjure and was recluded in a convent for 2 years, with suspension from preaching for 2 more. Charles was so much interested in him that, notwithstanding his strenuous objection to papal interference, he procured from Paul III a brief of May 29, 1538, by which the sentence was set aside and Virues was declared capable of any preferment, even episcopal. When Juan de Sarvia, Bishop of Canaries, died in 1542, Virues was appointed his successor and died in 1545. Contemporary with these cases was that of Pedro de Lerma, a member of one of the leading families of Burgos. He was a canon of the cathedral and abbot of Alcala, renowned as a preacher and a man of the highest consideration. He had spent 50 years in the University of Paris, where the Sorbonne made him dean of its faculty. Happening to read some of the works of Erasmus, he was so impressed that they influenced his sermons. He was denounced to the Inquisition, which imprisoned him, and after a long trial he was required in 1537 to recant 11 propositions publicly in all the towns where he had preached, confessing that he had taught them at the instigation of the devil to propagate error in the Church. He was so humiliated that he abandoned Spain for Paris, where he was warmly received as dean of the faculty and where he died in 1541. The people of Burgos, we are told, who had regarded him with the greatest reverence, were so impressed by this that those who had sent their sons abroad to study at once recalled them. This atmosphere of all-pervading suspicion and this exaggerated sensitiveness to possible error exposed everyone to prosecution for the most innocently unguarded remark. Miguel Mesquita, a gentleman of Formique, Teruel, appeared January 19, 1536, before the Valencia tribunal in obedience to a citation and under the usual formula of being told to search his conscience. He intuitively recurred to Erasmus and related a talk which he had, some 5 or 6 years previous, with a Dominican, in which he had defended the Enchiridion on the ground that it had been subjected to examination without being condemned. This, however, proved not to be the cause of his summons, for Pedro Fora, a priest of Teruel, had denounced him as having said that Luther preached the gospel and was therefore called an evangelist, while the followers of the Pope were called papists, and that Luther was right in maintaining that Scripture did not say that Christ gave power to St. Peter, but to all the apostles. Mesquita explained that he had been several times to Italy and had been sent to Flanders. The priest had asked him what was said about Luther, and he had merely gratified his curiosity by repeating what he had heard abroad in common talk. He earnestly implored to be released, for he had 8 children, 4 of them studying in Salamanca, and when suddenly carried off from home he had left but 6 sueldos in his house. Fortunately for him, the inquisitors were not unreasonable, and on January 29th he was allowed to return to his family. But the case remained on the records to be brought up against him should any malevolent neighbor see fit to distort some careless utterance. End of section 49.